Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that takes a good hard stare into the guts of film like a necrophiliac at a bus crash. Now, with my writing partner Sam currently on holiday in Scotland, I thought I'd fill this brief window with something that's been really bothering me lately, so if you'll allow me, I'd like to put forward my case for my problem with reboots. Let it be known that I don't necessarily have a problem with rebooting a series as a concept. If done correctly, it can certainly breathe new life into an otherwise dying series. My problem specifically is to do with the formula that seems to be frequenting reboots lately. I stumbled across this when I was watching the Man of Steel episode of Doug Walker's Bum Reviews with special guest Zod, in which he said,
"I laser-eye thingied the original writers of this film, thus forcing them to instead get the creators of Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, who have done nothing but try to recreate Batman Begins and The Dark Knight."
Well, that's just bollocks. But I must have had that idea sitting in the back of my mind for weeks to come, because when I saw the recent Man of Steel Nostalgia Critic episode, Doug said this.
"When I see this movie, I see people dying for the sake of getting violent, craving teens in the seats. But that's not what you see. You see one of your favorite superheroes being tested and put through a greater challenge than ever before. And by having him witness and go through so much intensity, it makes his challenges seem greater and his struggle all the more interesting. For you, and probably a lot of the people that enjoy this movie, you're seeing the Man of Steel go up against some of the greatest evil that he's ever gone up against."
And at that exact moment, combined with the quote from the Bum Review, I leapt out of my chair and went, Eureka! Because at that moment I had just discovered the theory of tested physically, broken emotionally. Tested physically, broken emotionally is a template story implemented by screenwriters to up the stakes for a character. Most commonly used recently in reboots, the theory goes that you take an iconic character and you put them through some kind of endurance test, in which they struggle but ultimately persevere, giving them a chance to look incredibly heroic to the audience, only to be finally crippled by something close and personal to them, most likely the death of another character. So where did all this come from then? Why has this type of story become popular amongst Hollywood screenwriters? Well, this is the part where I make my case. In 2005, Batman Begins was released to critical praise and eventually grossed a little over $374 million worldwide. What Batman demonstrated is that you can reinvent a popular character as being more fully rounded than previously, whilst at the same time staying true to his original form. That, and among other things, me and Sam are thinking about revisiting the Dark Knight trilogy at some point, but we make no promises. The movie itself didn't so much adhere to the theory, but what it did do is put the idea out into the open that it is possible to handle the reinvention of a character intelligently. And with the James Bond series effectively dying a sad and tragic death back in 2002, it was then time for MGM's turn to re-establish their trademark series with Casino Royale. Casino Royale is probably the best example of tested physically, broken emotionally, because not only does it adhere to this theorem to the letter, but it's also the one that executes it the best. At the beginning of the movie we see a fresh and new Bond played by Daniel Craig, but he doesn't quite feel like the character yet. It's only when he meets his intellectual match in the form of Le Chiffre that the game is really set, and over the course of the film Bond has to maintain a straight face whilst at the same time battling terrorists in a hotel room, almost dying of heart failure after his martini is spiked, and even at the end when Le Chiffre whips him in the bollocks with a rope, Bond refuses to give in even when staring in the face of evil. But he is eventually crushed at the end after the betrayal and death of Vesper Lynd, a treasury who he had been romancing over the course of the film, and it's only after her death that he becomes the romantically removed Bond that we know and love. Casino Royale of course ended up being a massive hit, and it was almost like Christopher Nolan and David Goyer were watching and they went, alright motherfucker, we can do that, except we're going to do it with not one but two characters instead. The Dark Knight was released in 2008 to widespread critical acclaim. It isn't a reboot, of course, but it does adhere to the formula in regards to the three central characters. In a way, they're set up a bit like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, in that each character gets a good 10 minutes to introduce themselves. We start with the Joker's bank robbery, and then we're reintroduced to Batman as he takes down some goons in a car park, and then we meet Harvey Dent in court. And after our three central characters are introduced, the game begins. In this context, the Joker is trying to break two characters at the same time, and it works to some degree, albeit it feels slightly askew. Harvey is the character who gets it the worst because he's broken both physically and emotionally after Rachel Dawes gets blown up and he becomes Two-Face. Batman, on the other hand, only gets broken emotionally at the halfway mark. But what makes it work is that up until that point, the audience feels that Batman has been well and truly physically tested, and it's his internal strength that propels him forward. What I find interesting about Christopher Nolan's work from The Prestige onwards is that they all seem to have one connecting theme, the idea of emotions getting in the way of professionalism. I mean, Jesus, this is literally what Inception was about. Anyway, The Dark Knight ended up being a massive success beyond anyone's wildest dreams, and from this point on everyone wanted to emulate that success. So next up for the reboot was Spider-Man. In terms of implementing this formula, The Amazing Spider-Man just doesn't really work, mainly because in order to set up tested, physically broken emotionally properly, the central character needs to spend an equal amount of time with the loved one as well as the villain. Casino Royale was really strong in this area, and so was The Dark Knight to some degree, but The Amazing Spider-Man fails because the villain isn't particularly well characterised and only really becomes active in the film's second half. And despite the fact that Captain Stacy dies and now Spider-Man can't be with Gwen anymore, which makes it a little bit subversive because the loved one doesn't actually die, the audience never feels that Spider-Man has been well and truly tested before he's emotionally crippled. I mean, sure, his chest gets all fucked up and he really gets beaten down during the fights, but it doesn't actually have any effect on him, seeing as he just continues bouncing around like an acrobat. You can certainly see that they've tried to make tested, physically broken emotionally work with Spider-Man, but it's just so sloppily executed that it falls flat on its face, particularly in that really fucking stupid moment with the cranes. Speaking of being subversive earlier, it was around this time that writers began experimenting with the formula. Believe it or not, Dredd to some extent has elements of the formula in its plotting, but what they do is they get rid of the broken emotionally part and turn it into a full-blown action flick in which Judge Dredd is truly put through the ringer. And it works because Judge Dredd doesn't need anyone to cry over because he's motherfucking Judge Dredd. Also on the subversive side, this year Star Trek attempted the formula with its sequel, Into Darkness, in which Kirk is tested physically and dies, which results in Spock being broken emotionally, only for Kirk to inexplicably come back to life at the end of the film, which just completely negates the fucking point. Meanwhile, in 2012, Christopher Nolan and David Goyer were trying to find ways to reinvent the formula with The Dark Knight Rises. And in a way, it just doesn't really work because Bane breaks Batman physically and then, well, sod all else, really. Even when Miranda Tate betrays him at the end and reveals herself to be Talia al Ghul, you never get the sense that he's been emotionally broken, especially in the last few moments when he's sitting in the restaurant with Catwoman. Because he doesn't get broken emotionally, you never get a sense of payoff for his physical punishment, which essentially means that when Bane breaks his spine and has to recover, the movie officially peaks when he escapes the prison, and now that Batman is fully recovered, he isn't left with much of a challenge anymore. But after that film, I get the sense that David Goyer must have picked himself up and dusted himself off and said, alright, well, we kind of failed, but let's try something a bit different. Man of Steel is probably the second best reboot to implement the formula after Casino Royale, because not only does it pull off tested, physically broken emotionally incredibly well, but it manages to refresh the formula in a way that keeps it interesting. In the past, the only real challenge that Superman had been given was him holding up incredibly heavy things, and in a way they kind of parody that by at the beginning making the two first tasks of our hero, which had always seemed the easiest, be him lifting incredibly heavy things, namely a school bus and an oil rig. But it's only when Zod and his gang show up on Earth that his true challenge is set. And boy is it a tough one for Superman to overcome because the fight scenes are incredibly harsh. How Man of Steel subverts the formula is at the very end, because after Zod pushes him to the limit and tests just how strong Superman really is, Superman ends up snapping Zod's neck, and after realising that he's the last Kryptonian left in the universe, the death of the villain of all things is what breaks Superman down in the end. Why David Goyer manages to make this work so well is because Clark is characterised as a victim who can't fight back against the bullies because he's too powerful. So when Zod shows up, Clark not only sees him as the ultimate school bully, but as someone who physically matches him, which is why for the first time we're able to see Superman punching things as hard as he can. And in the end he possibly takes it a bit too far in breaking his neck, and this hopefully means that he'll learn to be a defender of Earth rather than on the offensive. But that last part ultimately depends on whether or not a sequel will adhere to this. So overall, what do I think of tested, physically broken emotionally? Well, I don't think it's entirely a bad thing. It allows for some decent character building moments and it makes a character's final moment of triumph all the more tremendous. But what I will say is I feel that screenwriters seem to be relying on it a bit too much. We've seen that it's possible to reinvent the formula in ways to keep it interesting, but to be honest, I'd rather see a brand new type of story in regards to iconic characters. I know how we all want to see our favourite characters really dumbfounded by a scenario, but I'm getting the sense that we're not even really trying to invent new types of stories to test our favourite characters. So that's my case for my problem with reboots. Let me know what you think, and I guess it's up to you whether or not this is case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, and that's my problem with reboots.